So now we talk about Mars in Synastry. And of course, as you would expect, Mars in Synastry is a somewhat challenging facet when Mars interacts through two charts. You can feel that intensity and that potential for arguing and difficulty and stress that comes from Mars. Now in particular, when you get Mars, like for instance one person's Mars and another person's ascendant, one person's Mars and another person's moon, one person's Mars and the other person's 7th house, you can have issues. Now and of course the Mars person will feel frustrated, or the other person who's receiving the Mars, like the moon person or the ascendant person, will feel the frustration and intensity and and perhaps anger of the Mars person very easily. It's really best to not have Mars interacting very much with any planets, at least directly through conjunction. Of course, the planets aspect as well, and that's a consideration. As soon as we start getting into outer planets as well, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn cast special aspects that have to be considered. And so those aspects are also somewhat important. They're secondary to a conjunction though, but in particular, if you get double aspects to certain signs or houses, certain planets, then it'll be meaningful. I'll talk about that in another video though. But there's also the thing called Kuja Dosha, which, to be honest with you, I really don't pay so much attention to the classical Kuja Dosha, but I pay attention to the principle. What I mean to say is, when you look at the Kuja Dosha rules, the placements for Kuja Dosha, some make sense, they don't all make sense, and it also leaves out quite a bit. For instance, things like combustion isn't part of Kuja Dosha, or Mars-Rahu conjunction in a person's natal chart, or other things. So it's not necessarily, I look for the principle. Again, like the way I work in astrology is really to look at universal principles as much as anything, and certain thumb rules or things like Kuja Dosha, which doesn't make as much sense the way it's applied, at least literally, I don't look at so much, but I look at the principle. Because with Kuja Dosha there are particular houses, if you don't know what that means, that it's actually called it's a blemish mainly for a female native, where if Mars is at a certain place, it creates problem with marriage. It's said to kill the husband. But then there's also these things that cancel it, that cancel Kuja Dosha, it's said. But there's a lot of things, as I said, that's not included in Kuja Dosha classical, the classical Kuja Dosha. So I just look at the principle, which is basically a principle that I've already described. When a woman has an excessively strong masculine energy, it can create some difficulty. If it comes from Mars, Mars is that planet of aggression, and it can create some difficulty. Again, it's not a judgment. It creates difficulty in the relationship because the woman herself wants to be in the receptive role. When Mars is really strong, like if a woman has Mars in the 1st, Mars in the 7th, other things, it can be quite a bit because her nature to want to be in the receptive role in a relationship is somewhat hampered. And again, if this sounds like an outdated teaching, please go back and look at earlier videos and see why I explain this. It doesn't mean a woman's supposed to be a doormat. It doesn't mean she's supposed to be subservient and all like that. It means women are trying to bond through their feminine in a relationship. Men are bonding to their masculine. And so usually the man's masculine needs to exceed the woman's masculine when if there's going to be a harmonious vibe. So this is a principle that you look for anyway. When a woman has a powerful and assertive Mars, it's going to run into issues with the men that she's with, and the man will have to have a Mars that exceeds her, or a masculine nature that exceeds that Mars quality in the woman. Otherwise, she's going to be in that masculine role in a relationship, and it's not going to feel good to her over time. So the principle is still the same. You don't have to look literally for Kuja Dosha, though. That's my point. The principle is still the same, and it's already shown in the masculine-feminine principle, so you want to look for that. And again, all things considered, Mars, the man's Mars interacting with the woman's chart is much easier than the woman's Mars interacting with the man's chart. Especially something like the man's Mars in the woman's 7th house, it's definitely a strong glue, by the way, and Mars can be a strong glue, but it's a glue of intensity. Again, realize with Synastry, we're talking about the buttons that are getting pushed. Someone's Mars pushing another person's buttons, especially if it's ascendant or moon, can be a little difficult. Now, man's Mars on woman's Venus, that's actually an appropriate button to push, because that's a very strong sexual button. It creates intensity for sure, but the woman's Venus wants to receive the man's Mars. And again, you can reverse it, woman's Mars on man's Venus, and it's kind of backward. And she's in the initiating, perhaps, sexual role. So, again, Mars ascendant, Mars in the ascendant person will feel the Mars of the other person, and it can be intense. Again, if it's for a woman receiving the man's Mars, maybe it's not so difficult, but she's still going to feel his anger, which could be a problem, but feeling his intensity could be very exciting and it's a strong bond. Mars Sun, it's kind of like a combustion. Again, that's a lot of fire. So it can create some competition and some fighting, but also maybe some healthy boundaries if it works out the right way. But again, all relationships of Mars through Synastry are going to have that quality of intensity and anger and frustration, even if it's something that works along the gender integrity, like the man's Mars and the woman's ascendant, or the man's Mars on the woman's Venus. Man's Mars on woman's moon, or anyone's Mars on anyone else's moon, you don't like it too much at all. I don't really like it. Again, it's a strong glue. It is a glue. Mars on a moon can make for a lot of glue, but it also creates that problem with the moon person. Mars Mercury, you can feel there could be some anger and some frustration and some arguing with that on any direction. Mars Jupiter, because Jupiter is probably the best friend of Mars, this can definitely create a situation where the Jupiter person sort of teaches the Mars person about not being so frustrated and angry, but of course it's at the expense of the Jupiter person's peace of mind, sort of. It's kind of like an older brother, like an older sibling relationship that can play out, that could maybe not be so difficult over time. But again, it's still going to create that intensity. If Jupiter is an important planet to the other person, like if Jupiter is the other person's seventh lord or ruling planet or something, or in whatever house that's influencing, it'll be intense. I already talked about Mars Venus. Can definitely have a strong sexual bond in a good way, especially if it's the man's Mars on the woman's Venus. The reverse, it's still going to create a bond, but maybe one that's backwards. And Mars Saturn, again, this, you don't like it so much because Saturn wants to create structure, Mars wants to destroy it. It's worse for the Saturn person because, again, Mars actually debilitates Saturn, because Saturn is debilitated in Aries, but Mars actually is exalted by Saturn because Mars is exalted in Capricorn. So this is better for the Mars person, not so good for the Saturn person when you get the Mars-Saturn through Synastry. Either way, it feels like willfulness, control, kind of power struggle going on. Mars-Rahu, again, not so crazy about that through Synastry. You can just feel how Rahu is going to explode that Mars energy. K2 Mars through Synastry, again, one person's K2 on the other person's Mars. It has an explosive potential. The K2 is going to be sort of critical of the other person's frustrations and the other person's, aggression, which can definitely lead to explosiveness. So, as you would say, Mars is probably my least favorite planet through Synastry. Mars or Rahu, but Mars probably, as far as one of the lights, is my least favorite to see with a connection through Synastry. So, there you go.